Okay, let's pray. Get started. Father, thank you for the challenge this morning, for the good illustrations that stick in our minds and help us to draw Bible truths into sharper focus. And we just pray for Caleb today as he shares the contents of this case study, and as we consider the ramifications and try to make decisions based on the principles of your word. You'd give us good conversation, good interaction. I pray in Jesus' name. All right, Caleb, you are on.
Cool. All right. So the story today was a communal feast. Just a summary, Jim and Anne are missionaries to Indonesia among the Javanese people group. They have been trying to integrate themselves into the community, but have come across some difficulties. Many people are unwilling to visit them because their property is connected to the church property. Recently, they were invited to attend the Slamatan, which indicates their acceptance in the community. To go to this would help them build main bridges, as it is a central event in the Javanese culture. However, the celebration also has a very significant spiritual side. The food that is later eaten is offered to the spirits, and a prayer is offered to Allah. Many local Christians and missionaries in the community have refused to take part in the Slamatan festival because of these issues. The Slamatan reinforces the bonds of the community, and to reject the invitation would be similar to a rejection of the community itself. So what should Jim do? The main characters in the story are Jim and his family, so he is the one who will be responsible for making the decision. He's a new missionary to this Javanese village in Indonesia. He, his wife, and his children have been there for just over a year and have really been trying to integrate with the community. This seems like a great way to do it. So the central issue of the story is whether or not Jim should accept the invitation. On the one hand, accepting it would help build more connections with the community. However, accepting it could cause problems in the church or even moral issues. So one of the questions I've had to deal with thinking through this, and even when I went to Africa, I had to deal with a similar situation with the Muslim holiday of the Eid. I think this one is a little different, but very similar principles apply. The question comes down to, or one of the questions is, should a Christian eat food that is offered to spirits, even for the purpose of relationship building? So,
Sorry.
So,
Caleb, did you do the reading for today?
Yeah.
Okay. Just kidding.
So, there are basically two alternatives in the situation. Either accept the invitation to the Slamatan or to reject it. So, what are some of your thoughts? What would be some of the consequences of accepting the invitation, and what would be some of the consequences of rejecting the invitation?
Would you accept it? You look like one of them.
Accept you look like one of them?
Mm-hmm.
Can you be a little more specific? Is it okay to look like one of them, or should we not try to look like them? What do you mean by that?
Well, we'd be in the world, not of the world, kind of. And if they're like, eating the sacrifices and like partaking in sacrificial offerings, we shouldn't be. Then we look like we're okay with that.
Yeah. And on that one hand, it would help integrate them into the community. I think that's one of the more positive aspects of accepting it, and a bit more of what you're going after. But what else? Maybe some of the consequences or repercussions of rejecting it, or the issues of accepting it as well.
By doing it, you're almost giving approval, like it's okay to like do these sacrifices to the spirits.
Yeah, giving approval. That would be one effect of accepting the invitation.
The downside to accepting it, you could cause the other Christian brothers to stumble because they came out of that idolatry and that just that false religion, they came out of that. To eat the meat offered to them would essentially show them, oh, okay, you can do this. They start doing that, they could fall right back in.
Yeah.
It would be harder later on to teach them because you did take it. So like if you try to teach them later on, they'll be like, then why did you do it then? But why can't we do it now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about the consequences of rejecting the invitation?
Since it's something very important for them, probably kind of a rejecting their culture, who they are, what they do, so they could get offended, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know exactly what that would lead to in the Japanese culture, but my guess is some sort of ostracizing from society or pulling back away from them, a lot more coldness in relationships. It could be one issue of rejecting the invitation.
Can I just ask a question related to that? Do you think that they would view it differently in light of the fact that this guy's a foreigner? Would they put the same expectation of conformity on him that they would put on their own people?
Probably not. Like, I don't know, like, it depends on, like, what country you're talking about. But there are some places where people don't expect foreigners to follow through. But I'm not sure what it would be in this case.
I think that like they might not expect as much out of the foreigners, but let's say one of their people becomes a believer, I think it's gonna be harder on that person because they're expected to go based on tradition. But the foreigner's not really. So I feel like it's gonna be harder for people to come to saving belief because they don't want to be ostracized from tradition.
I think perhaps like they probably wouldn't have the exact same expectations of the foreigner, and so maybe not as much, not as harsh of a reaction against when they reject the invitation. But at the same time, I think there would be a loss of that positive relationship growth that would come from accepting the invitation.
How much time does Jim, is that his name, Jim? How much time does he have to explain all this to people?
How much time does he have to explain it?
Yeah, when was he, how long, what's the window of time here?
He was invited this afternoon, and it's in the evening when the sun sets.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have a lot of time.
So you can almost imagine him saying, Lord, this isn't fair. I need some time. If I had a week, I could sit down and talk with these people, explain some things and try to help them understand. I don't have that opportunity.
So I was also thinking, does anybody else see another alternative to the kind of obvious ones of just accepting it or just rejecting it? I know I kind of thought of the culturally appropriate way, maybe just like try and book something else or say like, oh, I really have something else to do that day, which might run into problems there too, especially since you're on the day of. It might be hard to come up with something. But
It's like what we talked about in culture anthropology, where you say yes to something, and then, or it was in one of the books that I read, Cross Cultural Conflict, where you say yes to something, And it's part of their culture that they always say yes, even if they don't actually want to go. And then they'll come back and make an excuse and say that, yeah, sorry, even though I did say yes. I don't know if he said yes or not, but even if I did say yes, I was just saying it out of politeness and something came up and I have to go to that instead.
Yeah. And in some cultures, you don't even have to say something came. You just don't go. And then later on, when you see them again, then you explain, I'm sorry, I didn't come. That happened all the time, even in Brazil. You would never say, no, I'm not going. I mean, very rarely. Is that okay to do that? Go
Can
ahead.
we go to the feast and just not eat the food? Or is that like worse than not going?
That was another alternative I was thinking about. So that is another alternative. What might some of the consequences of that one be?
You're still going?
You're still going? Yeah. I know, I was thinking of that one. You're going there to the festival, and then you just don't eat the food when it's offered. I don't know. That might just seem a little offensive.
Yeah.
Or very offensive to the culture, perhaps even more offensive than just not going.
When you go, you're kind of elevating their expectations. Oh, he's here. And they're excited. And so the disappointment can be even more severe when that moment comes and you don't participate.
Because at that point, you're shaming them and dishonoring God.
Yeah, publicly. Mhm. Yeah.
Well, did anyone have any scriptures that they thought might be applicable to this situation? I have one passage. You can't steal my passage. I had one passage and then looked at another one that might have some implications for it. But any principles, perhaps?
Paul talks about meats offered to idols and how that isn't in and of itself wrong. It's Christian liberty. But, I mean, my concern would be causing a brother to stumble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, he stole my passage now, so.
Did I?
That's right.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's one that came out for me. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 through 10. So long passage of scripture, but Paul has a lot to say about that. And there's, I think, a lot of wisdom in being able to walk through that beforehand. It's never something I really thought I'd have to deal with, literally, meat offered to idols, but.
Okay, but in that passage, does he make any exception? No, he says that the gods are nothing, right? But does he set some parameters?
Yes.
Are there certain conditions under which you should or should not?
He does. So I guess maybe we can walk through that a little bit. We can share a bit of what I've learned in that passage, and then maybe see what position we'd all take or something. But yeah, so the issue is dealt with in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. Chapter 8, Paul talks about the issue itself of food being offered to idols. Chapter 9, Paul talks about surrendering his rights. And then there you have that famous verse, to all people I have become all things. So we'll deal with that when we get there. And in verse 10, he kind of comes to his conclusion of the argument. So what was happening in the church of Corinth? There are some believers who had come out of the Corinthian lifestyle, who had previously offered meat and sacrifice to idols, and then that meat was later eaten in the temple or given to the marketplace, and it was sold there for people to eat of it. The issue was that the strong good Christians who knew that these idols weren't really anything were fine to go and eat the meat offered in the market because those gods don't exist. They're just worthless idols. But then a weaker brother would come along and they'd see that and they'd see, oh, they're eating that. They're eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols. Well, I guess I can go do that, even though it's against their conscience. and they would stumble. So that's really the issue Paul talks about in chapter 8. In chapter 9, he also deals with the freedom of Christians to eat because God has given all food for men to enjoy. But in chapter 9, he talks about surrendering his rights. So Paul as an apostle, had a right to claim his living from the gospel. He deserved to be paid for the work that he is doing, but he gave that up for the sake of the gospel, and so that he wouldn't bring offense to those who were there. Now, he comes to this point in chapter 9, verse 19 through 23. I'll read, and this would be one verse people might use in support of accepting the invitation. So he says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." So I think we could all see from this passage how people could use this to say, well, you should accept the invitation to become all things to all men so that you can bring the gospel to all. And certainly there would be an aspect of which going to this Slamatan would present opportunities to build relationships, to become all things to all people. But Paul doesn't stop his argument there. I personally think that what he deals with in chapter 10 actually trumps what he talks about in chapter 9. Not in the sense of chapter 10 being more inspired, but in the source of his reasoning, he does come to a different conclusion when it comes to food offered to idols. So chapter 10, I think we're going to go to, actually verse 14 I'll start at. But I was reading an article by a Catholic group in preparation for this that actually made a lot of connections between the Eucharist, so the Lord's Supper, and the Slamatan festival. They made the case that the Slamatan festival should be celebrated by Catholics because it has because it's kind of like another Lord's Supper. And so therefore it's okay for them to celebrate the Slamatan in a Christian or Catholic way. And so you just keep that in mind as you walk through these verses. That actually really made them jump out to me because this is exactly what Paul is dealing with. So he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14 and following, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So, kind of in summary of that point, Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, the bread, and the wine as participating in Christ. And then he goes and he talks about this food offered to idols. And he says, by participating in that food offered to idols, you are participating in the very demons that they are offering those to. So Paul actually comes down pretty hard here on the issue of food offered to idols, in the sense of it is somewhat an issue of liberty, but actually participating in food that has been offered to idols is participating in the table of demons that food has been offered to. And then in addition to that, you come to the end chapter. Paul does provide a couple exception clauses to when you can eat. One of those is verse 27 and 28. He says, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. So maybe I'll get you guys' thoughts on there. But what do you think about that verse in application to our scenario?
Kind of seems like it'd be simple to go, like, when you're actively participating in spirit
No, I'm sorry, can you say that again? I didn't hear.
worship. It kind of seems like it'd be a sin to go because, like, you're actively participating in the spirit worship.
Yeah, especially dealing with the previous verses 14 through 22, be the principle I'd see in there. What about from verses 27 to 28? If an unbeliever invites you to dinner, wasn't Islamatan dinner? And you're disposed to go? So what are your
What
thoughts?
does Paul mean when he says, if an unbeliever invites you to dinner, don't ask questions? What is he implying by that statement, don't ask questions?
Eat it in ignorance,
Ignorance of what? You're right.
whether or not it was part of the worship.
Exactly. So is not Paul stating there that if you're not sure if this was offered to idols or not, if that's not involved, then don't ask, just eat it. Is that what we're dealing with in this case study?
The thing is that this is a celebration where it's obvious it's gonna be that. So like he already knows, and the people probably already know that he knows.
Mhm.
So even though he hasn't asked questions, they still know.
Because there's really no questions to ask,
Yeah.
right? Everybody knows everybody knows.
So it would be kind of like if they had said, yeah, this is offered to idols. Like they didn't say it, but it would be that instance.
Mhm.
As I was thinking through this, I almost would consider this circumstance, Islamatan, closer to the believer going into the temple of the idol and eating the meat sacrificed to the idols there. Because that's really what the Islamatan is. You're going to the place where it's sacrificed and you're eating it where it is sacrificed. There's no questions to ask. Yeah, kind of like you said, and we go back previously in the passage, and Paul says, no, you can't do that. And then comes down to those reasons in chapter 10.
I think it's interesting in the last verse you read, he said, for the sake of his conscience and the other person. That's it, because I feel like we're all thinking just in the conscience of like the believer, but also it is for the sake of the other person too. I'm not for sure how exactly. Maybe.
Supposed to be a testimony.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what verse 29 says, the next verse. The conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. So, not so much for your own conscience sake.
So he gives two reasons there for not, for sake of your brother, it could stumble for sake of conscience. Yeah, which conscience? Brother's conscience, your own conscience?
The other person's conscience. What verse 29 says, at least.
Okay,
It says not for your own, but for the sake of
Okay.
the other.
And I think too, like it depends, like if you struggle with that, you do it for your own conscience.
Right.
Like how Cody had mentioned, if it's someone that is coming out from that, you wouldn't do that just because of your own conscience. But if it's something like an outsider who doesn't struggle with that, then it would be more for the conscience of the other people that would like see it.
Okay.
Um,
Is there anything else in that text, chapters 8 through 10, that falls into the for the sake of category? You mentioned for the sake of your brother and for the sake of conscience. Is there anything else that should be a test ground for participation? It's a big passage. Look back at 9:23. You read that one, Caleb. What's 9:23 say?
I do all things or I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share it with them in its blessings.
Yeah. So what's the criterion there?
For the sake of the gospel.
Yeah. So what do you think he means by that? How's that play out for the sake of the gospel?
He became all things for all people so that he would have more opportunities to share the gospel. That's why he does what he does.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. That's one way of looking at it. He's doing it for the sake of opportunities to share the gospel. Okay. Is there any other way you could take that passage?
I think I see it as removing unnecessary offenses to the gospel.
Okay.
You could also look at it in the sense of maintaining the purity of the gospel, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? There are two possible ways of seeing that. You could say I'm doing everything for the sake of the gospel in the sense that I don't want to offend the truth of the gospel in any way, compromise the truth, or for the sake of getting the gospel in. Is there anything in that context that would sway your thinking to one of those or the other?
I mean, all the preceding verses are about him becoming all things to all people. That's where my mind immediately goes with that verse then.
Okay.
Then the following context, he goes the other way with it too. So,
So maybe they're both involved, huh?
I'm kind of confused though, like if Paul's saying that like in the second part he's saying, okay, this is sacrifice to demons, like it's like demon worship, eat it. But in the first part he's saying it's okay to eat it in the meat market or whatever. Like I'm not really understanding.
It's a good question. Because on one hand, he says demons are nothing. We know that demons are nothing, right? I mean, they're not that they don't exist, but that doesn't affect the meat in any way. There's nothing inside the meat that's going to contaminate you. But then on the other hand, he says, well, if it's offered idols, don't touch it. Is that?
Yeah.
So how do you resolve that?
Because if it's at the temple, you're like participating in the act of idol worship and idol sacrificing.
Hmm.
If you're like there, as opposed to you're just in the market and discount meat, let's go.
Yeah.
I think it kind of goes back to like not knowing, being ignorant type of deal, like not asking questions about it, because if you just see it at the market, you don't know where it came from sometimes.
Even though in that culture it was like
That's true.
almost pretty sure it was from the temple.
Would all the meat be from
No, but if I remember, it's the cheaper meat. You get
the No,
Yeah.
cheaper.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
so chapter 10, verse 29 goes back to the conscience of the brother. So conscience, I say, not for your own, but for the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So, I don't know how that factors in then. It's like, if you're just going to eat meat, sure, get the discounted stuff. If you're giving thanks, all to the glory of God. But if something like that, where you could cause a brother to stumble, I'd be more cautious.
I think there is also an element of participation in the service at which the meat is offered. You see that in the contrast with the temple. Like the temple is very clear, like where it is offered, you don't go in there. And then like, even with the Lord's Supper, we recognize like it's about that service, that time of remembrance. But after you go out from that, you don't like put the rest of the leftover grape juice in this like holy fridge to keep it special and separate. There's nothing special about that grape juice in itself, but there's something special about that time of communion that the church spends together. So you guys, Paul uses that as kind of a parallel. I'd argue there's something about being in the presence of that offering.
So to some degree, it can be the difference between what is obvious and what is not. As Paul says, if you're not sure if this was offered, just eat it. No. But when it's obvious and when everybody knows, be careful because conscience and offense is at hand. So you guys were, name brands, and like I've heard people say such and such a brand. There's been reports that some of these are made in sweatshops. Well, I know about a certain brand of shoes, and there's evidence that these are made in sweatshops. So do I stop buying that particular brand of shoes because I've heard that? Or do I say, I don't know which ones were and which ones weren't? If I knew, if it was well known to everybody that this brand, that's all they do, they make them in sweatshops, I probably would not buy them. But when you don't know they were or not, say, hey, I don't know where these are made. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And that may not be a really good analogy, but it's just an attempt to try to illustrate that difference between what is known, what is obvious, and what may or may not be true. But in this case, is there anything not obvious? Is there any way that Jim could come away from this saying, well, I wasn't totally sure about the significance or what they were doing? I don't see any way out for him, in that sense. Unless you think of something in the story. Let me ask you this, Caleb, and maybe you mentioned this in your presentation. I don't remember hearing it. This is a two-pronged issue in a sense that there are two ways that this impacts his doing this or not doing this with the people. Remember what they are or anybody? The two impacts that this ritual has.
The community and what's the other one? Protection from misfortune.
And for what?
Protection from like bad luck and the spirits and stuff.
Okay, yeah. So how would you generalize those? One pertains to what and one pertains to what? Just real general.
Social
Yes.
and
Religious.
spiritual.
Yes. Right? You have a social consideration here because this does unite the community. Didn't he say, or maybe, I don't know if it's this article or another one I found online, something about when they come together, it's almost like all of them serve as a protection to one another when they do this. They're getting protection from the demons, but the fact that they're doing this together almost serves as a social buffer protection for them. Do you remember reading anything like that? I was trying.
I don't think I remember.
Okay. Pulled up an article somewhere about that. So you have the social part, which is really what he's after. He would like to be able to justify this, right? Because he's been working hard to fit into the community, and this would help. But the problem is that other prong.
So, in looking at this issue, I also came to a couple other verses that, as we look at, as I think you guys probably know where I stand on this one by now. But the impact of rejecting that, would that hinder all gospel opportunities? So I had a reference from my study Bible to John chapter 13, verses 34 through 35. It says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." And so you kind of have that priority of love is actually a way that people know we are Christians, and showing love to another brother by not partaking in that Slamatan, I would argue, is one way that other people will know that we are the disciples of Christ, and is actually a greater witness than good relationships.
Well, are you aware of any type of ritual like this in Myanmar? Do they do things like this? And are you aware of anything? Pardon? Yeah, ceremonies or rituals like this in Burma. I should know if it was something that you would have heard about.
Maybe, but I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. Just curious.
Where I live is like all of Christians, so I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead and finish. I have a couple things I'd like to say in the conclusion, but I don't want to come in at the wrong time.
I think I'm pretty much done. That's most of what I had. Unless anyone else wants to add anything.
Any other thoughts come to your minds that you want to contribute?
It's interesting to see that the other Christians don't go to the Islamatown.
They don't, right? Yeah.
Yeah, some local and missionaries.
Okay.
So.
And what is his status as a missionary? He's new. Yeah, and I'm telling you, this is a very important principle you brought up. If he was the senior patriarch missionary, then doing something that goes against the flow may be legitimate, depending on certain. Not this case, but I'm just saying in general. But especially when you're even if he could justify this in his own mind and say, "Hey, I've gone through Scripture. I'm convinced that this is okay." All right. The fact that he's a new missionary, and the missionaries traditionally, have not participated in this, is only going to present a problem. And that's just a principle I would say to you guys, no matter what issue you're dealing with. If there's something that's questionable and you have absolutely no problem with it, okay? And I've seen new missionaries come in and want to change things like that, and they have even good arguments. But just the fact that they're new, okay, should give them pause. Say, this isn't the right time to do this. That's good. That was good. Anything else come to your minds? Another thing I would say to you is that you'll find in a situation like this or similar situations that you can't stall forever. And I think what Jim would like to do is be able to have some stall time. That's why I clarified the fact that he just found out about this afternoon. So he's in that's what makes these case studies really juicy. He doesn't have time to do that. So now what? It's kind of a similar situation that the wine drinking was that we talked. Was that yours? Who did the one on drinking wine? Beer. Yeah. Sometimes you're caught in a situation, right? So it does remind us of the importance of trying to prepare yourself as much as you can before you ever go. If this is that big of a ceremony, then I'll say this as kindly as I can. There's little excuse for him not to be aware of this before he ever gets. This is a major thing. In fact, one article I read said that this Javanese is the largest, is like 100 million people, in Indonesia. It's the largest people group in that region. And this is an ancient, well-known, well-established custom. It's spelled a bunch of different ways, but so how is it that Jim, even though he's new, how is it that he has not been told, or, you know, and I'm not saying that you have to be experts in your field before you ever go, okay? But this just seems like something that's, you know, hey, it's out there, it's big, it's obvious, and so, you know, do your homework as much as you can. You'll never know everything, but this is a huge thing that I'm surprised that he hasn't known about it and been able to think it through before this. Having said that, I did some stupid things in Brazil, the things I should have known better, you know, but is everybody in agreement? I'm assuming you said we all know your position, but you might as well state it just to be clear.
I don't think he should go.
Okay. Do you have any idea how he could express this? I realize there's a lot of cultural baggage here, but any ideas of how he might go about communicating this?
I think one possibility, like you kind of mentioned, would be to not go, and then later when you see them, they have a bit more of a buffer time to be able to explain a bit more, as opposed to just rushing over and saying, "Hey, I can't go. Here's my reason." Boom, 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 and then run away. But just, I think having a little bit of the culture in there, just not going and talking about it later.
Good. Yeah, trying to come up with a list of logical arguments in this culture probably isn't going to get you very far, because they're going to wonder, you know, is logic more important than family? Our people, our unity, harmony? See, and so it's that old battle between truth and harmony. And the ecumenical movement really functions on that principle. You know, harmony is more important than unity, or, you know, put away our doctrinal differences so we can all love Jesus and serve Jesus. So about the best you can do in a situation like that, you say, I am so sorry. I know that this is going to offend. I know that this is not going to honor our community, and that really hurts me. But I also have to remember that my God will be dishonored if I go. We mentioned this in another class. And so just remember, when you're in that honor shame culture, bring it up. Say, it hurts me deeply to dishonor your family and your community. But if I honor your community in this situation, I will have to bring shame on my God, and I can't do that. You could even ask him, would you do something that would bring shame on your God? You know, and so try to tie together the dishonor that you know is going to result with the dilemma that you're in, that you're going to have to dishonor somebody. And my Bible tells me that in all things I must honor God first. And it may or may not satisfy. I'm not saying that it's going to guarantee satisfaction, but at least you've made an effort to explain the dilemma that you're in, and using honor shame language to do it. Yeah, satisfied? Anybody? All right. Hey, you did a good job. It's a fascinating subject, and I appreciate you good work on it. All right, so Cody, we expect nothing less on Thursday, man.
Yeah, Cody.
What is yours again? So everybody remembers?
I can't remember the number.
That's okay. I think it's number.
Weddings Republic.
Number 3.
Number 3. All right.
Excellent.